The knock on the door was hard, aggressive even, like someone wanted to make a point. I had been expecting this moment for weeks, but it still startled me. My heart raced, and my mind scrambled to catch up. It was the kind of knock you only hear in movies, urgent, demanding, like something was about to break wide open. I had to remind myself to breathe, to stay calm, but all I could think about was one thing: how my parents had never cared about me before. So why now? Why was this happening? I opened the door, half expecting to see someone from my past. Maybe it was a neighbor, someone from the old apartment I used to live in. But it wasn't. The person standing there wasn't familiar in the slightest. It was a man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. He didn't look like someone who had come to make small talk. His eyes were cold, professional, like someone who had seen too much and didn't care to speak in pleasantries. Is your name Sarah Blackwell? He asked, his voice flat, like it was a simple question, but I could tell there was something more to it. Yeah, that's me, I said, instinctively stepping back to let him in. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight through the door and into my apartment like he'd been there 100 times. I was still processing the fact that a stranger was in my apartment when he set the briefcase down on my coffee table and opened it slowly, as if he was handling something fragile. My pulse quickened. What the hell was going on? I'm from a company called Corrington and Associates, he said, pulling out a thick, sealed envelope. I've been instructed to deliver this to you personally. It's regarding a legal matter. I raised an eyebrow. A legal matter? About what? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid the envelope toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. There was something unsettling about the way he was looking at me, like he was trying to gauge my reaction, but he wasn't giving anything away. I had no idea what this was about, but my gut told me this wasn't something simple. Open it, he said, almost in a command. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm, like he expected me to follow through, no questions asked. I hesitated, but something in his presence made it clear I didn't have much choice. I ripped open the envelope with shaking hands, and inside was a letter. The letterhead was unfamiliar, but the words inside, those words hit me like a truck. Dear Ms. Blackwell, we are pleased to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary of an estate valued at $1 million, following the recent passing of a relative who was not previously known to you. Enclosed, you will find further details about this estate and the necessary steps to claim your inheritance. Please contact our office immediately to arrange for the next steps. I stared at the paper for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. I didn't have any relatives who would leave me $1 million. My parents had made it clear I wasn't welcome in their life. They barely spoke to me, never acknowledged my existence unless they had to, so the idea of someone leaving me this kind of money felt like a cruel joke. What's going on? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't have any family. I'm an only child. This can't be real. The man didn't flinch. I understand this is a lot to process, but this is your inheritance. All the information you need is in that letter. Our firm will handle everything. I shook my head, the disbelief clawing at my insides. $1 million? From someone I didn't even know? I looked at him, trying to get a read on his expression. He wasn't telling me everything. There was a weight to his silence, something he wasn't saying. And that nagging feeling in the back of my mind kept telling me this wasn't just about money. Something bigger was at play, something I wasn't seeing yet. He stood up slowly, closing the briefcase, and looking at me like he was waiting for me to say something, anything, but I didn't know what to say. My brain was racing in too many directions. My life wasn't a fairy tale. So why would someone leave me money? Why would anyone care enough to leave me anything at all? Is there anyone else involved in this? I finally asked, still trying to grasp what was happening. Do my parents know about this? The man's eyes flickered for a moment before he answered. I'm afraid your parents aren't involved, Miss Blackwell. This inheritance is solely yours to claim. I was stunned into silence. The words didn't seem real. I had no family, no real connections, and yet this man, this stranger, was telling me that I was suddenly a millionaire. But then, just as quickly as he had arrived, the man was gone. He turned and walked out the door without saying another word, leaving me alone in my small apartment, holding a piece of paper that had the potential to change everything. And that's when I realized something else, something that made my stomach turn. This wasn't just about the money. It was about something I had ignored for years. It was about the truth. Something I didn't know, something I'd been blind to all along. But that truth would take time to reveal itself. Time I didn't have, because everything was about to change. Everything I had ever known was about to be flipped upside down. I didn't know it yet, but this would be the beginning of a story I could never have imagined. I couldn't stop staring at the letter. My hands trembled as I set it down on the table, my mind still trying to process the words. I kept reading it over and over, but it didn't make sense. Who was this relative? How could they leave me anything? I hadn't even known them, and from what I knew about my family, they weren't the type to leave anything behind for someone like me. My parents hadn't even sent a birthday card in years, and now, some mysterious relative was leaving me a fortune? It didn't add up. The phone rang, snapping me out of my thoughts. I jumped slightly, still holding the letter. When I looked at the caller ID, it was my mom. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not since I'd left home for college. I had learned over the years that if I didn't call her, she wouldn't call me. But now, she was calling me. I hesitated, not sure if I should pick up. My mind was still swirling with thoughts of the letter and that man, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. So I pressed the button and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice sounding more distant than I intended. "Sarah, it's Mom," she said, her voice too chipper, like she was trying to sound more interested than she actually was. "I was just thinking about you. How have you been? You doing all right?" I frowned. This was exactly how she always sounded, superficial, like she had a script she followed every time she decided to call me. It wasn't genuine. It wasn't even close to the warmth I'd always wanted, but I had grown used to it. After all, I'd lived most of my life just trying to meet her expectations, which never seemed to be enough. "I'm doing fine," I replied, unsure what else to say. "What's up?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her weighing her words. We've been meaning to catch up. We're all doing well. Just thought we'd see how you're handling everything." It felt like she was trying to say something, but I couldn't figure out what. "Handling what?" I asked, suddenly a little suspicious. She laughed lightly, but it was strained. "Oh, nothing really. Just everything. You know how it is. Anyway, I was thinking it's been a while. Maybe you could come home for a visit next weekend. It's been too long." I froze. Something about the way she said it set off alarm bells in my head. I hadn't seen her in months, and the last time I visited, I didn't even get a proper greeting. The idea of her suddenly wanting me to visit felt wrong, like she knew something was about to happen and was trying to get ahead of it. "I don't know," I said cautiously, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I've got a lot going on with school and work. I don't know if I can make it." "Come on, Sarah," she pressed. "It'll be good for you. We'll talk. It'll be a nice weekend, just like old times." I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping up on me. There was no reason for her to act this way. She had never acted this way before, and the more I thought about it, the more my suspicions grew. But she wasn't going to let this go. She was persistent. Too persistent. "All right, fine," I finally said, my voice flat. "I'll come up." There was a brief silence before she spoke again. "Great. I'll send you all the details. It's going to be so nice to catch up." I hung up the phone, still feeling like something was off, but I didn't know what else to do. I had to go. It wasn't like I could avoid it forever. My parents would make sure of that. The next few days passed in a blur, and I couldn't get the letter out of my mind. I had done some research on the law firm, Corrington and Associates, but there was nothing unusual about them. They seemed legitimate, but the more I looked into it, the more questions I had. Who was this relative, and why hadn't they reached out to me before? It was all too convenient, too perfect. If my parents knew something about this, they weren't saying anything. And for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were involved somehow, even though they denied it. Then, the night before I was supposed to leave, the real shock came. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I stared at it for a moment before opening it. "I know you found out. Don't believe everything they tell you. It's not what it seems. Be careful, Sarah." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the message, trying to figure out who it was from. There was no name, no indication of who had sent it, but I couldn't ignore it. Was it from the law firm? Or was it someone who knew something I didn't? I wasn't sure, but it was clear that someone was watching me. I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. Whoever had sent the message wasn't going to talk to me directly. I felt a sudden rush of panic. This wasn't just about some inheritance anymore. Something bigger was going on, and I had no idea what it was. The next morning, I drove up to my parents' house with a heavy heart. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the kind of tension you can feel before a storm. When I arrived, my mom greeted me with her usual forced smile, and my dad, who I hadn't seen in over a year, barely acknowledged my presence. They were both acting strangely, like they knew more than they were letting on. "Good to see you, Sarah," my dad said, his voice flat, like he was saying it out of obligation rather than desire. "Let's get you settled in." I didn't know what to say to that. Nothing had changed. It was still the same cold distance between us, the same lack of warmth, the same indifference. But something told me this time would be different. Something had shifted, and I had no idea what it meant. I walked into the living room, and the tension in the house grew thicker. My parents sat on the couch across from me, their eyes flicking nervously between each other. They weren't speaking, but I could tell they were both waiting for something, waiting for me to bring it up. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could feel the weight of it in the air, pressing down on me. And that's when I knew the secret they had been hiding for years was about to come crashing into my life, and I had no way of stopping it. I sat there, my palms flat against my knees, staring at my parents as they avoided my gaze. My mind was racing, but I couldn't figure out what to say. They had invited me here under false pretenses. I was sure of it. The letter, the mysterious message, the strange way they were acting, it was all connected, and I needed answers. But I wasn't going to get them by sitting in silence, so I decided to break the tension. So I began, forcing the words out despite the knot in my stomach. "What's going on? Why am I here? What is this really about?" My mom's lips pressed into a tight line, and my dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Neither of them seemed ready to answer. I was about to press further when my phone buzzed. I glanced down at it without thinking, and there was another message from the same unknown number. "They know. Don't trust them. They've been lying to you all along." My heart dropped. I could feel a sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. The message was too specific to be a coincidence. Whoever was behind it knew exactly what was going on. I looked up at my parents again, trying to gauge their reactions, but they were too good at hiding their emotions. They had always been this way, distant, closed off, but this was different. There was something in their eyes, a flicker of guilt or fear, but it was gone before I could fully register it. "Sarah," my mom finally said, her voice tight but trying to sound calm, "we have to talk about something important. Something you're not going to like hearing." I raised an eyebrow, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "What's that?" She hesitated, glancing at my dad before continuing. "We've been keeping something from you for a long time now, and it's time you knew the truth." My stomach twisted with unease. I had a feeling I wasn't going to like what was coming next, but I needed to hear it. I needed to know. "Just say it, Mom," I said, trying to sound more composed than I felt. She looked at my dad again, her eyes pleading with him to say something, to take over. But he didn't speak. Instead, he stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists, as though he was trying to hold something back. It was clear he wasn't going to be the one to break the silence. "I'll do it," she finally muttered, her voice barely audible. "You're not the only one who's inherited something. It's not just about the money, Sarah. There's something much bigger going on here, and you've been kept in the dark all your life." I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. The tension in the room was suffocating. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "What do you mean, bigger? I don't even know who this relative is, and now you're telling me there's something else." "We didn't want to tell you," my dad said, finally looking up at me, his face pale. "But it's time you knew. You're part of something much bigger than you think. Something that goes back generations." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "What the hell is going on? What are you two talking about?" They both looked at each other again, and then, in a strange moment of unity, they both stood up too. My dad spoke first, his voice much firmer now, as though he had gathered the courage to face whatever had been weighing on him for years. "Sarah, you've always been kept out of this, but the truth is you're not just our daughter. You're also the heir to something else, something that we've been protecting from you." I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. This couldn't be real. It was like a bad dream, one where nothing made sense. Heir to what? I asked, my voice rising in frustration. What could I possibly be heir to? The company, my mom replied quickly, as if the words were automatic, though her voice cracked at the mention of it. The one you've never heard of. The one that's been in our family for generations. I froze, staring at her. A company? What are you talking about? I've never heard of any company, and you've never mentioned it. It's not something we could talk about, my dad said, his tone suddenly defensive. We had to keep it hidden from you. It was too dangerous, too risky. You weren't ready for it. I was beyond confused at this point. Dangerous? Risky? What the hell are you two talking about? How could a company be dangerous? They exchanged another look, and it was clear that they were holding something back. My mom sighed, rubbing her temples as though the weight of this conversation was taking its toll. It's not just a company, Sarah. It's a legacy, a secret one that's been passed down for generations. And now it's yours. You're the next in line, and that's why you've been given the inheritance. I felt a chill run down my spine. A legacy? A secret? None of it made sense. My whole life, I had thought of myself as just a regular person, struggling to get by, to make something of myself. And now they were telling me that I was part of some secret legacy? That I was connected to something I had no idea about? You're lying. I spat, the words bitter in my mouth. I don't know what kind of game you two are playing, but this doesn't make any sense. My dad's face hardened. It's not a game, Sarah. We've protected you from it for years. We thought you were better off not knowing, but now it's too late. You've inherited it all, and you have no choice but to take it, whether you like it or not. My stomach twisted again, this time with a sense of dread. I didn't want any part of this. I didn't want to be involved in whatever twisted legacy they had hidden from me. But something inside me told me I didn't have a choice. I was already involved, whether I liked it or not. Just as I was about to speak, the doorbell rang, cutting through the tension in the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked at my parents, who were both visibly startled by the sound. I'll get it, my mom said quickly, her voice suddenly too high, too forced. She hurried to the door, her steps quick and almost frantic. I stayed where I was, my mind racing with the chaos of everything I had just learned. I didn't understand any of it, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I didn't know it yet, but the person standing at that door would change everything. The doorbell rang again, its shrill tone slicing through the tense silence. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do, my mind still reeling from the bombshell my parents had just dropped on me. The heir to a legacy? A secret company? How could they keep something like this from me for so long? The words felt foreign in my mouth, as though they didn't belong in the same sentence as my name. My mom was already at the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. I wanted to shout at her, to demand answers, but something held me back. There was an urgency in the air, a feeling that whatever was about to happen would change everything. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it, but I didn't have a choice. She opened the door slowly, as if trying to brace herself for whatever was on the other side. But when she stepped back, it wasn't a stranger standing there. It was a man in a black suit, his face unreadable as he looked past my mom and straight at me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and the instant they met mine, I knew he wasn't here for a casual conversation. "Are you Sarah Blackwell?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. I nodded, suddenly feeling very small in that moment. The man's presence was suffocating, as if he carried the weight of something I couldn't see. My parents stood behind him, their faces a mixture of concern and fear. It was as if they were waiting for something, some kind of signal or reassurance. But there was no comfort in the man's expression. "I'm Agent Harris," he said, producing a badge from his jacket pocket and holding it up for me to see. "I'm with a private investigation firm, and I need to speak with you about something urgent." My heart skipped a beat. Private investigator? I glanced at my parents, expecting them to explain, but they were silent. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, each second dragging on like a heavy weight pressing down on me. "About what?" I finally asked, my voice tight with uncertainty. The man stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room as if assessing every detail. "About the inheritance," he said, his voice low but clear. "You've come into possession of something that doesn't belong to you, and it's time you understood why." The words hit me like a slap. Inheritance? I thought I had just been handed a lucky break, a $1 million gift from a mysterious relative. But now, it seemed there was more to it, much more. "I don't understand," I said, my voice faltering. "What do you mean it doesn't belong to me? I don't even know who this relative is." Agent Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to my parents, his eyes cold as he studied them for a moment. My mom's face had gone ashen, and my dad looked like he was about to break into a cold sweat. They knew something. I could see it in their eyes, but they weren't telling me anything. "I'll explain everything," the agent said, finally addressing me. "But we need to do this somewhere secure. It's not safe for you here anymore." I could feel my pulse racing, but I didn't know what to say. I was terrified, but I couldn't let myself show it. The man was already moving toward the door, and before I knew it, my mom stepped aside, letting him pass. There was no protest, no objections from either of them. They were letting this stranger take me away, and for the first time, I realized just how deep this whole thing went. "Come with me," Agent Harris said, turning back to look at me, his expression unreadable. "We don't have much time." Without waiting for me to respond, he led me out the door and into a sleek black car parked in the driveway. The door was already open, and I hesitated for just a moment before sliding into the back seat. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off, leaving my parents standing in the doorway, watching us go. I could barely see their faces through the rear window, but I could tell they weren't happy about this. The drive was long, the silence between us thick and uncomfortable. Agent Harris didn't say a word, his eyes focused on the road ahead. I sat there, trying to make sense of everything, but the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. What was going on? Why had my parents lied to me all these years? Why hadn't they told me about the legacy they claimed I had inherited? Finally, after what felt like hours, the car pulled up to a nondescript building in the middle of the city. It looked like any other office building, but something about it felt wrong. There were no signs, no markings to indicate what it was, just a plain, gray structure that stood out in the otherwise busy neighborhood. Agent Harris led me inside, his movements precise and efficient. The hallway was dimly lit, and I had to force myself to keep my breathing steady as I followed him down the narrow corridor. We stopped in front of a door, and he knocked twice before pushing it open. Inside, there was a small conference room with a table in the center and a few chairs scattered around it. The room smelled sterile, like it had been cleaned 1,000 times but never truly lived in. Agent Harris gestured for me to sit at the table, and I did, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. He took a seat across from me, pulling out a file from his bag. The sound of the papers shuffling was the only noise in the room. He placed a file in front of me, and I hesitated before reaching for it. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low but insistent. "It's the truth about your inheritance, Sarah. The whole story." I opened the file slowly, my eyes scanning the first few pages. The information inside was overwhelming. It was about my parents, about the company they had been hiding from me, about the legacy they had protected for generations. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. My name was listed as the sole beneficiary. But beneath that, there was another name, a name that I had never heard before. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "This person, why is their name here?" Agent Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched me closely, as if weighing his next words carefully. "The person whose name you see there," he said finally, "was the original owner of the company. Your grandfather, Sarah. He's the one who created it. And he left everything to you." My heart stopped. My grandfather? The man I had never known existed? How could he have left everything to me? The truth was beginning to unfold in front of me, but it wasn't the truth I had expected. It was something far darker, something far more dangerous. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, I realized just how deep I was in, deeper than I could have ever imagined. I couldn't process the information. The name on the document burned into my mind, and yet I couldn't make sense of it. My grandfather? The man I had never met, who had died years before I was even born. The company, the legacy, none of it made sense. My whole life, I had felt like an outsider in my own family, like I didn't belong. And now, suddenly, I was supposed to be the heir to something that had been kept hidden from me. Agent Harris didn't seem to notice my confusion. He was watching me intently, waiting for my response. I could feel the weight of his gaze, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The questions were piling up in my mind, but they were tangled and incoherent, impossible to untangle in that moment. Finally, I broke the silence. Why didn't they tell me? My voice was shaky, a mixture of disbelief and anger. Why didn't my parents say anything? Why keep this from me for all these years? Agent Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as though he had been waiting for me to ask that very question. Your parents did what they thought was best. They believed you were safer without this knowledge. They didn't want you involved in the company, in its business. They thought it was too dangerous for someone like you. I felt a surge of frustration. Too dangerous for me? I'm their daughter. Why did they think I couldn't handle it? Why was I kept in the dark? Agent Harris sighed, a deep, almost resigned sound. The company isn't what it appears to be. It's involved in things that your parents thought you'd be better off not knowing. They've been protecting you from it. But the truth is, the moment you received that inheritance, you became part of something bigger than yourself. You can't walk away from it now. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over me. But I don't want it. I don't want any of this. I didn't ask for it. I didn't ask to be part of whatever this is. I just want to live my life. Why did he leave it to me? Why me? The agent looked at me with a mix of sympathy and something darker, something I couldn't quite place. Your grandfather saw something in you. He knew you had the potential to carry it forward, to take the company in a new direction, away from the dangers it had been involved in. But he couldn't protect you forever. And now you have to decide what to do with it. I let out a bitter laugh. What? You're telling me I have to take over this company? That I'm supposed to fix whatever mess they've created? I don't even know what I'm dealing with. I'm just a college student who won a lottery. I never asked for this. Agent Harris's expression softened for the first time. I know this is overwhelming, but you're not alone in this. You don't have to face it by yourself. I stared at him, my mind racing. What do you mean? Who else is involved? The agent hesitated before responding. There are people who are watching you, people who want to see how you handle this. You'll have allies, but you'll also have enemies. Your family has been protecting you from them, but now that the inheritance is yours, they'll be watching your every move. My heart pounded. Enemies? Why? What have they been involved in? What did my grandfather create? Agent Harris didn't answer immediately. He stood up from the table, walking toward a nearby filing cabinet and pulling out another folder. He placed it in front of me, and I opened it, my hands trembling. Inside were more documents, photos this time, pictures of people I didn't recognize, business deals I didn't understand. But one photo stood out. It was a picture of my grandfather standing with a group of men. They all had stern expressions, and the atmosphere in the photo was heavy, as if something was about to go terribly wrong. This is why your parents kept you away from it, Agent Harris said, his voice quiet. Your grandfather's company wasn't just a business. It was involved in arms deals, underground operations. It was a network of power and influence. People who were dangerous. I felt sick to my stomach. My grandfather? A part of something like that? I couldn't believe it. I don't understand. How could he be involved in that? And why would he leave it to me? Why would he think I could fix it? Agent Harris sat back down across from me. He believed in you. He thought you could make things right. He knew you had the intelligence, the drive. But he also knew it would be a fight. It's going to be hard for you, Sarah. There are people who don't want this to change. They'll stop at nothing to keep things the way they are. I ran my hands through my hair, tried to process everything he was saying. My grandfather had left me a legacy, but it wasn't the kind of legacy I had ever imagined. It wasn't wealth or success. It was a burden, a responsibility that I wasn't ready for. But now that it was in my hands, I couldn't ignore it. I had to decide what to do with it. The silence between us grew heavy, and I looked down at the file in front of me. The photo of my grandfather, the stern faces of the men surrounding him. It all felt like a nightmare. I wanted to walk away, to forget everything I had just learned. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. I couldn't turn my back on it, no matter how much I wanted to. Is there any way out of this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Agent Harris shook his head. Once you've accepted the inheritance, there's no turning back. But you can decide how to move forward. You can choose to take control of the company, to clean up the mess your grandfather left behind, or you can let it fall into the wrong hands. The choice is yours. I closed the file and stood up, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have all the answers. But for the first time, I knew that I had a choice. And maybe, just maybe, I could make a difference. I walked out of the room, leaving Agent Harris behind. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it. Whatever came next, I knew I couldn't run from it anymore. The legacy was mine, and I had to decide how I would carry it forward.